Okay, hi class. So in today's video, it's going to be pretty short, I think. I'm going to uh, talk a little bit about what Thomas Joyner talked about in the prologue, in the introduction. Uh, in particular, his theory of suicide, known as the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. I think this is worth spending a little bit of extra time on because it is one of the more important theories in suicidology today. So he developed this theory back really in the early to mid 2000s, but it continues to be one of the most influential theories in suicidology, and it influences the way researchers think about suicide to this day. And so uh, this is a basic, I guess, Venn diagram illustrating the three important components uh, of suicidality. But the interesting thing that this theory did, it was the first to really consider how people move from thinking about suicide to acting upon those thoughts and making a suicide attempt. So the I guess, ingredients that Joyner would claim are necessary for an individual to engage in suicidal thinking are thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. So, thwarted belongingness is a sense of being alone, a sense of that you're uh, you're isolated, that you don't have adequate social support, that that no one particularly cares about you. And, you know, kind of to match this is this idea of perceived burdensomeness. So, feeling not only am I alone, I'm actually a source of stress for others. So, I'm not connected to people. And also, the fact that I exist makes other people's lives more difficult. So, those two factors are critical in developing a desire for suicide. So we tend to associate those two factors for with suicidal ideation. Now, one of Joyner's main arguments in his theory is that suicide is uh, terrifying. It is a very anxiety provoking thing to think about, much less do. And we're programmed, a lot of uh, our evolutionary adaptations have programmed us to avoid things that would cause death, right? And obviously with suicide, those mechanisms that are meant to sustain our lives are overridden. And so Joyner thinks, and I tend to agree with him just to a large extent, uh, that in order to develop the capability for suicide, you have to in some ways overcome your fear of death. And he posits a number of different ways that you might be able to do something like this. So um, one of the most common, uh, I guess, behaviors uh, that is pointed to in terms of increasing capability for suicide is non-suicidal self-injury. So the act of injuring yourself repeatedly um, reduces the innate anxiety you experience when you're hurt or when you're harmed. And so by engaging in those self-harm behaviors, you're actually increasing your tolerance for dangerous behavior, which could include suicide. So even though non-suicidal self-injury is considered to be a separate thing, it is a risk factor for suicide attempts, right? So you can imagine a situation where a person self-injures repeatedly, and as they continue to self-injure, the self-injuries may become more severe, and this reduces their fear of hurting themselves and in fact dying. And so it's that acquired capability for suicide that can lead to the attempt. Now, self-injury isn't the only method by which individuals may increase their capacity or their capability for a suicide attempt. Um, uh, Other things um, like physical risk taking. So there's people have noted a higher suicide rate among people who engage in kind of those extreme sports, skydiving or base jumping or those kinds of things that have a lot of danger in them. Again, the idea is they're more able to carry through that very scary act because they've engaged in those kinds of scary acts before. And so other examples, I'm trying to think, can include like abuse survivors, people who have survived extreme injuries or severe traumas. Again, their experiences have caused them to, in some ways, habituate to the idea of death, or the habituate to the fear of death, I should say. So again, just to kind of sum up here, we think, or Joyner proposes, and many in this field agree that thwarted belongingness, not having sort of that's, or not necessarily not having it, not perceiving having adequate social support or connectedness with other people, plus a perceived burdensomeness that you're actually a load on other people rather than some sort of benefit to other people. Those two things combined to produce suicidal thinking. And then if we were going to move from thinking to actually suicidal behavior, that requires some acquired capability for suicide. So again, I just wanted to reiterate that because it's really important. It would be a shame if you took a suicidology class and that this theory didn't get brought up. There have been some revisions to this theory that we will talk about in the coming weeks, but this is really kind of the start of modern suicide theory. There have been past theories. We'll talk a little bit about some of the more historic ones like Schneidman, and the concept of psychache, but we'll hold off on that for now and just get into the Joyner stuff. The other thing I wanted to do in this video is just to, you had a bunch of great questions. Y'all submitted some really, really thought-provoking questions. I wanted to knock a couple of them out here because even by doing this, we still may not get to all of them in our class discussion on Tuesday. But I wanted to take the questions in this video that may clear something up about the reading itself that's more factually based, in case it happens to come up on the quiz. And I wanted to take questions that I could just kind of answer relatively quickly, and that I think probably aren't as good for a class discussion. That's not to say they're not good questions and interesting questions. The questions I'm going to go over in a minute are very good and interesting, but I kind of wanted to knock these out that were more factual in nature, so we could have more time to talk in class about some of the questions that are a little bit more conceptual and that we may not have an answer to, that's more based on sort of, I guess, conjecture or educated guesses about what might be going on. So I'll go ahead and take a couple of these questions. And these aren't I didn't put these in any particular order. I just read through the list, and as they appeared, I pulled this set down to answer today in the video. So first question is, when discussing violent daydreaming on page 57, what defines the term violent daydreaming for suicidal people? Secondly, where can I find this study if I'm interested in reading it? So yes, in this study, individuals were said to be engaging in violent daydreaming if they had repeated thoughts during the day of either preparing for their suicide attempt, the actual attempt itself, or the possible outcomes of that attempt. And what they found was that tends to make improve their mood when they were do that, even though it poses additional risk. So it's basically using mental imagery to walk through what it would be like to engage in a suicide attempt and to imagine the outcomes of that attempt. I do know where you can find this study. This was a study published. Joyner was on the team. He was not the lead author. The lead author's name is escaping me. But the good news is I put it up on As You Learn as an optional reading if you want to take a look at it. It is an interesting study. So please, by all means, if you're interested in the details of that study, take a look at that article that I posted. Second one, what is the difference between intending to die by suicide and desiring to die by suicide? Do those, and this, I grouped these two questions together because I found them to be somewhat related. So do those who wish for suicide actually want to die, or do they want the life they have, they live in currently to end? To me, there's a difference between the two. I think that's a pretty astute observation. And that could be, I think that highlights the difference in that first question. So the intent to die by suicide functionally often serves as an escape of life that suicidal people view as miserable and unbearable and also unchangeable. So if there's those two opinions, you've got a pretty dangerous mix that suicide becomes a risk. So in clinical practice, we also see this. I've talked a little bit about ambivalence before, but for the most part, the way suicidal individuals talk about suicide is not the idea that death is the preferred outcome. It's that escape from life is the preferred outcome. So they might not actually desire to die, but they may intend to die in order to escape these unbearable circumstances they find themselves in. And so that's, I think, really where the difference is. That this is the only answer to get relief from where they currently find themselves. Again, because their situation is seen as unbearable and unchangeable. And so hopefully that makes sense. And if there are additional follow-up questions, I'm happy to take them in class on Tuesday. But really, it's about relief and escape more than it is about the actual desire to be dead. So question 3, have means of suicide attempts changed over time, or are they pretty much the same? I thought this was a really interesting question. I'd never been asked this before, so I had to do a little digging, and I did find an answer. So yes, they have actually changed over time, although they haven't changed radically in about the last 100 or so years. Yeah, about 100 years, almost exactly. So I've managed to find some information on suicide means stretching back to the Civil War era, so around 1860. And from 1860, which seems to be the first, I guess, organized records that made some attempts to keep track of suicide and suicide means, 1860 to about 1900, hanging was the most popular method of suicide. Now, interestingly, around 1900, the most hanging became the second most popular to poisoning and overdose. So overdose, again, around 1900 became the most popular means of suicide, or the most common means of suicide. And I think I can understand why that is. It's because this was a period of time. So you may have heard of patent medicines. So medicines, and really dangerous medicines, were much less regulated back then than they are today. So you could walk into a drugstore and buy various serums and medicines that contain things like cocaine and contain things like morphine without a prescription. Interestingly enough, at this time, so there was a morphine epidemic that occurred in the late 19th, early 20th century. And so a lot of people were addicted to morphine. It was a huge problem. And so some genius scientists actually tried to come up with a less dangerous substitute for morphine. So, maybe not as many people would die from opioid addictions. And the medication he came up with that was supposedly safer, a safer alternative to morphine, was heroin. So the replacement for morphine around this time was actually heroin. Turns out that's not safer. So for about a period of about 20 years, really during the height before tighter regulations of drugs and medications, so controlled substances, medications were the number one. Now, around between 1910 and 1920, medications got passed. What did they get passed by? They got passed by firearms. And so firearms took over as the most common method or means of suicide and has been on top of that hill ever since. So for roughly the past 100 years or so, it's been firearms. But prior to that, there's some evidence that there were different things. No, interestingly, this has to do a lot with access, right? It's what people have access to. So when, firearms weren't as common, nor were they as efficient as they are today. So, you think about muskets and things like that, maybe not a preferred method for suicide. So it was hanging. Then when all of these very dangerous, potentially lethal medications were introduced, they became the most popular method of suicide, or common method of suicide, I should say. And then as firearms progressed, and you get to things like cartridges, so instead of having to load black powder in a ball, and you get things like semi-automatic firearms. So I find it interesting that really almost exactly coinciding, firearms took over with the advent of the 1911 .45 caliber semi-automatic pistol. So firearms get cheaper, more efficient, more available. They become the more common method. So I think interesting observation there. When someone attempts suicide and it doesn't work, do they keep attempting? I know the book talked about someone trying to die by suicide after their first plan not working, so they drove into oncoming traffic. Is that common? So I've said before that the best predictor of a future suicide attempt is a past suicide attempt, but I've also, I believe, told you that it's not a great predictor. And that's because we know that of people who make a suicide attempt and survive it, only 22% of those go on to make an additional attempt in the subsequent 5 years after their initial attempt. So it's a lot more common for someone with a previous attempt to make an additional attempt, but it's still not the majority. It's only 1/5 of people, 1/4 to 1/5 of people who made an attempt who go on to make another attempt. Now, there's sort of cumulative risk that goes on here. So people have made 2 attempts are even more likely to make 3 attempts. People who've made 3 attempts are even more likely to make 4 attempts, et cetera, et cetera. So it's sort of a compounding risk situation. But for first attempters, 4/5 go on to not make an additional attempt. So that's good news, and that's also why we say if you prevent a lethal attempt, there's a good chance you've prevented a death from happening, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later as well. Are hesitation wounds considered part of the planning to make a suicide attempt, or could they be considered an unsuccessful suicide attempt? So really what I wanted to clarify this. So hesitation wounds are generally thought to be after a suicide death. So that's evidence that there was some starting and stopping. And so hesitation wounds alone, I don't think, if you're wounded from beginning an attempt and you stop with just, like say you're going to cut yourself and you start cutting yourself, but you stopped, that would be considered an interrupted suicide attempt. We try not to use the word unsuccessful when we talk about suicide attempts. Really, we want to frame death as being the unsuccessful thing about the thing. So, we have a survived suicide attempt is generally the preferred language for referring for those, just FYI. But usually where we encounter research on hesitation wounds is for decedents, people who have died by suicide. And so what that suggests is that even though the person was able to carry that out, there was still a great deal of anxiety related to that. And it took them a couple of tries to maybe overcome that fear of death before they actually carried out the fatal suicide attempt. Last question I'm going to take for this video. Sometimes there are cases of suicide where multiple people in the family die by suicide. What kind of genetic components play into this? There are genetic components that play into this. You can look at there's a couple different ways to look at it. You can look at, there's some I guess, biopsychology or neuropsychology that's involved in this. So individuals who die by suicide are more likely to have fewer 5-HT receptors in certain parts of their brain. So these are receptors for the neurotransmitter serotonin. And so in specific parts of the brain, they tend to have less of these on their neurons. So the assumption here would be that serotonin, which is associated with mood, is not used as efficiently by those cells and may contribute to more negative mood. So that's one of them. There's also, and that is, those things are related to genetics. So the number of neurotransmitters you do have is influenced by genetics. So that's one way. In terms of kind of broader, not necessarily molecular genetics, more the classic behavioral genetics, certainly personality types, particularly high levels of things like neuroticism, are associated with higher risks of suicide. And we do know that there's substantial genetic components to personality as well. So there certainly is a genetic component to suicide and suicide risk, but I want to be careful to state that suicide is not genetic. Yes, families, if you have a first-degree relative who has died by suicide, you are more likely to die by suicide compared to the rest of the population. But a couple of considerations here: that relationship isn't super strong. It's not a fate. Your genetics don't make you die by suicide. And there's also messages about things like the acceptability of suicide. So if someone close to you dies by suicide, there's a social learning component there that could be a factor as well. So not just the genetic factors, but the learning component as well, that it may become more salient in your thinking because of your personal lived experience. It could be seen as a more acceptable option because of the suicide death of a family member. So I don't want to give too much credit to genetics in terms of our understanding of suicide, but it's also not correct to completely disregard genetics as a factor. So a lot of that research is just really started in the past 10 to 20 years. So I have a hunch we're going to know a lot more in the future than we do right now. So I think we're going to have to stay tuned a little bit to really get a more thorough understanding of the relationship between genetics and suicide risk. So that's all I have for this video. Again, bunch of great questions. Wanted to knock some of them out today. So on Tuesday, we'll come back and spend most of the class handling the rest of the questions that I didn't get to in this video. So until then, have a good one, and I'll see you next week.